So a lot of people know me as the mind map guy. That was one of the first videos that I made that sort of went viral. But the thing is that mind maps, most of the time, do not work. And let me explain why. A number of years ago, I was giving this seminar on study skills. It was one of the first times I've ever given a big seminar on study skills. And I remember that a student in the front row, she put up her hand and asked, "What's another technique that's not mind maps? Because I've tried it and it didn't work for me." And at the time, I wasn't experienced enough to really know the nuance behind the question that she was really asking. Years on, looking back at it now, that's a memory that sticks out to me because it was a very simple question and a very common thought that a lot of students have. A lot of you may have this thought as well, that you've tried mind maps before and it hasn't worked so well for you. And what's an alternative technique? And let me explain why that question is kind of not looking at things in the right angle. For those of you that are new, I'm Dr. Justin. I'm a former medical doctor, now a full-time learning coach, and it's my job to teach students like yourself and professionals how to learn and manage themselves more effectively. I've been practicing now as a learning coach for almost 10 years, and if you like the content, I'd appreciate if you give it a like and a subscribe. Now, the first thing that I need to establish straight off the bat is that the mind map is not a single technique. This is very important. See, a lot of people teach mind maps very differently. There are different methods, there are different books. Each guru seems to have their own kind of version of it. And I guess I'm no different. I have a very specific way that I teach it. But the thing is that most of these methods and very specific instructions on how to do the mind map are basically completely unsupported by any evidence or even theory. In most of the situations that I've seen, especially with some extremely common methods of mind mapping, which I won't name because I don't want to get sued, the guidelines seem like they were just the favorite flavor of the person that made that technique, and then they just felt that it would work or something, and then they published on it. And as a result, inadvertently, some of those recommendations actually end up being detrimental and can lead to a bad experience. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is that there are literally an infinite number of ways that you can make a mind map. Because what's important is not the way that a mind map looks on paper once you've written it all down. What's important is what's happening in your brain. It's about what you're thinking about and how you are processing the information that you consume in your mind, and how your note-taking technique facilitates that kind of thinking. It is a mind map of your mind. And just like if you go to a new city that has roads that are really hard to follow, and you look at the map and you think, man, this map is really hard to follow, you wouldn't say that therefore maps are categorically not effective. You would say that this city is disorganized. And if you had SimCity level god powers, you could rearrange this city streets and roads to make them more organized, and then your map would reflect that, and so it too would be more organized, and you would be able to use it as an effective reference point, as well as to facilitate your ability to navigate from point A to point B. Obviously, this is analogy because this is kind of also how the brain works as well. We form these networks, we form these pathways, and the more organized and the clearer the pathways are, I guess the better quality the roads are. That is how deeply we've thought about the connection and how explicit we are, because there's a difference, for example, between knowing that two concepts or ideas or facts are related together, understanding what the relationship between those is, and being very clear and explicit about the nature of that relationship and how important that relationship is compared to, let's say, another set of relationships that may be very similar. Those are different levels of thinking, different levels of knowledge mastery, and that also translates to a different ability to perform and retrieve that knowledge. It's very logical. And this is kind of all within this field of what we now call human cognitive architecture, which is one of the leading schools of thought behind how learning works. Now, the appearance of a mind map on paper can be a good reflection of what's happening in the mind. So often when we have students working through our program, myself and my coaches, we look at your work and then we pull out symptoms like a doctor diagnosing. We look at signs, we look at symptoms, we look at particular patterns. we say, if it looks this way, if they have demonstrated that they're writing words like this and there's a certain arrow going in this direction instead of the other direction, it indicates that they probably didn't think about a certain aspect of it, which informs us about the likely cognitive processes that you are using. But the tricky part is that there is a lot of variation between different individuals, different topics, even on different days. The same person studying the same topic may activate different cognitive pathways, and therefore they would have different thoughts. And therefore, those thoughts would affect other thoughts in a different way, in a different order. And if your mind map is truly reflecting your thought process, your mind map would actually look different as well. And you could, in some cases, actually get a different result in terms of your retention, in terms of the depth at which you were able to understand the information. So there are relatively subtle small differences that can make very large significant impacts. Anyone going through my program, you will know completely what I'm talking about here. And in fact, if you are going through the program, actually, can you leave a comment down below just to tell other people about how significant some of these tiny little nuances can be at affecting your result. So let's take an example. Let's take the 6 steps to a perfect mind map video that I made, and one of the first things that I talk about there, which is grouping information. Now, it seems relatively straightforward. All you have to do is group information together. How hard could it be to group information? Well, I'm just going to demonstrate to you right now how big of a difference it is in terms of how you group it and what thoughts you have while you are grouping it. So what I've got here is a list of some of the basic principles of learning. It's not a comprehensive list, but I thought it was enough just to set an example. Now, this could be a list of keywords that you got from your curriculum or from your coursework or wherever you're getting the information from. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to show how different ways of grouping can affect this. Now, the thing about grouping something is that it's not a checklist. It's not just like, oh, here's a group done, here's a group done, here's a group done. You're not activating much cognitively from doing that. You are comparing the ideas against each other, you are having to evaluate them, and you are having to use slightly higher orders of thinking to group something. Even if you're grouping it poorly, you're still having to do that. But the level and the depth at which you're thinking about things completely affects the quality of the group and therefore the quality of the learning. So for example, if I looked at this group and I just said, okay, I'm just going to group this based on the things that have the letter O in them. Well, then I'd group this and then this and so on and so forth. You get the picture. So that's not a very meaningful way of grouping, and you guys already know this intuitively, that that's not really going to produce any learning. It's kind of like a meaningless activity, but it's a spectrum, right? So that method of grouping is very brainless. It's very passive. And so a more active way of grouping it is to think a little bit more about each of the ideas to see how we can group it to make a bit more sense. But it's not binary. Like I said, it's a spectrum. So even if we're saying that it makes sense to group it this way, it makes sense to group it in multiple possible ways. So for example, it would make sense to group this list in terms of maybe the historical significance, things that were, you know, older schools of thought versus transitionary versus newer schools of thought. See, that type of grouping is very logical and actually makes a lot of sense. But alternatively, we could group the exact same set of words into things that are from a cognitive perspective versus a self-management perspective versus a self-regulation perspective versus a strategy perspective. And so these would also be completely logical and very valid ways of grouping it. Or we could do it in terms of things that are more theoretical versus things that are more practical. We could do it in terms of things that affect encoding versus things that affect retrieval versus things that affect both versus things that allow you to achieve them. So each of these methods of grouping would be potentially valid, and they involve different types of thinking. You can imagine that the type of comparison and the similarity and differences that you're looking at when you're looking through this list to see which one is historically significant in different ways is a different type of thinking and a different type of exploration as would be to divide it into encoding versus retrieval, for example. And in this process of grouping, we're gonna have to go through and we're gonna have to learn a little bit about each of the words, and we're gonna have to get a basic understanding of it so that we can form these groups. So this is the thing, is that the way that we're thinking about the groups completely affects the type of groups that we form, obviously, but also that changes the way that we're processing the information, and that changes the way that we're encoding the information. And there's obviously flow-on effects, because if we group, half of it in one way, that affects the way that we're going to group the remaining half. So let's say I use a slightly more passive way of grouping this information, and then I try to represent that on a mind map. And I'm going to show you an extremely common issue that occurs. So the tricky thing is that often when you're taught about things in a textbook or even in lecture slides, because of the way that most of the information you consume is written, it's in a linear format, usually left to right, down a page, bullet points and things like that, it's very difficult to show relationships, especially relationships between 3 or more pieces of information, because that's simply just the limitation of linear structures. You'd have to really explain a lot to show relationships. And if you've got 4 or 5 things that are interrelated to each other, you kind of need to have like a whole paragraph just talking about the nature of those relationships. Across an entire topic, that gets extremely overwhelming. So textbooks often structure their information in a way that makes it easily readable for a linear format. And so they group the information in a way that is suited for that. But that method of grouping is often not the best way of grouping it for our human cognitive architecture in facilitating our memory and allowing us to have high depth of knowledge. After all, someone that memorizes a textbook word for word clearly has a lower level of true expertise than someone that is able to use that information freely, back and front, side to side, all over, in a fluent way, fluidly utilizing all of those concepts to solve real world problems. There's obviously a deeper level of expertise, and that relies on their ability to manipulate that information and to find those relationships and navigate them. So let me give you an example here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this list of words and I'm going to group them in a way that would be very similar if you were to read about these in a book, for example. So let's see what that looks like. All right, so we now have a order that is kind of similar to how you might find it in a textbook. It's looking obviously a lot more organized. You can see that I shuffled things around. Now, I'm able to do this because I obviously have insight into each of the particular words themselves. If you were reading this in a textbook, it would already be laid out for you like this. Or if you needed to shuffle things around, you'd have to go through the textbook and learn a little bit deeper about it. Not that much, but maybe spend 30 seconds, a minute kind of reading about it just so that you can figure out, okay, well, I could move it here, I could move it here to see what makes sense. It doesn't take super deep knowledge to be able to figure out whether a group kind of makes sense or not, especially if you can revise it later. So we'll start with this, and let's say that we then want to represent this information in terms of a mind map. So that mind map would end up looking something a little bit like this. And there we have it. That took me, I don't know how long, but it was super boring. I'm glad I got that over and done with. So this is what it would often look like, with some changes and variations, obviously. This was a super passive process. And most people, when they do mind maps for the first time, it looks kind of similar to this. Now, here are the issues, okay? First of all, that took absolutely no brain power at all. My brain was completely not active in doing that process. And it was essentially just the same thing as writing this list, except in a non-linear format. So this thing here activated no real meaningful cognitive effects, and it's, kind of useless. I'm not really gaining much benefit from having done this activity. You can see it's basically the same thing as what was on the list. It's the only difference is that literally it's just in this webby kind of mind map format that everyone is used to. Now, here's where some of the problems start arising, is when we start thinking about it a little bit deeper, we start learning about it a little bit more. We know that we're meant to represent these relationships. So let's go through now and start identifying some of the key relationships, not all of them, just some of the ones that are really important that we want to show on this mind map. Okay, let's do that. Let's see what that looks like. All right, now we've got some relationships, and this is by no means comprehensive. And in terms of additionally the actual value that was added here, in this case, I already know the relationship, so I'm able to do this without looking at anything else. But in reality, you would be going through the words, you'd be reading about them, you'd be learning about them, you'd be thinking about them, and you'd be thinking, oh, this and this thing are related. And then you'd show that relationship and you'd draw it in. So every time I drew an arrow here, that process would take you maybe like 3 to 4 or 5 minutes per arrow, because you're having to read like paragraphs and think about it. Okay, so we've got relationships now. However, look at it. It's impossible to follow. You cannot see what's going on. It's super disorganized. Imagine going to a new city and then you get a map that looks like this. Who knows where to get anywhere? And your brain is thinking the same thing when it's hit with a difficult question that requires you to navigate these relationships and connect multiple ideas together to synthesize something that is at a higher level. It's going to be very difficult to do that with this, even though technically it's grouped and technically there are relationships that have been thought of and they have been demonstrated. So it ticks all of the boxes, but it kind of doesn't, because at a cognitive level, it still wasn't sufficient. It didn't really do much at a cognitive level. And this is why what I said at the very beginning, it's not about what it looks like on page. It is what is going on in your brain to create what is out here. And so if it looks disorganized here on paper, then it probably is going to also be disorganized in your mind as well. Now, yes, you can use different colors and you can arrange things and space a little bit differently. Trust me, I've seen many mind maps in my professional experience, not even looking at my own experience. It doesn't make a big enough difference. It's still gonna be messy, and it's still gonna be a very hard limit on the efficiency that you can gain. So this is not the way that we want to do things. So someone that does mind maps like this, it's just going to be a waste of time. You're really going to get no real benefit from doing this. If we want to have a higher quality of learning, and that is to spend time studying and actually have that information in our brain so that we can actually use it in real life purposes, we have to engage our brain and have a little bit more active learning, a bit more thought, a bit more processing, and a bit more effort injected into this process. And the thing is that even though that allows you to have better encoding, most people do not do that because they cannot be bothered, and they see that the effort is a negative thing. They don't understand the relationship that effort has, and actually saving them time and effort overall, because they are enhancing their memory, and so they're forgetting less and getting a deeper level of knowledge mastery. So I'm going to take that same list, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a few different steps, and I'm going to show you how the exact same information can look completely different. And I want you to really pay attention, again, not to what's on the page, but I want you to be more meta-cognitive. What that means is we're thinking about our thinking. I want you to think about what's going on in my brain, and I want you to think about what type of thinking does that engage in, and think to yourself, in what world would that result in my depth and knowledge mastery being worse? In what world would that make the knowledge less relevant? In what world is my memory not improved from engaging in that process? So let's go into that. Now, off the bat, every time I do a video, people are always asking for more specific, more examples. Learning is a complicated thing. It is not possible for just these tips alone to be sufficient for you. This is the reason why I have a whole program which takes months to go through to completely retrain yourself from start to finish in terms of how to learn these techniques properly. If you're interested in working with me to develop yourself from scratch and completely transform your learning system, then I recommend that you check that out. You'll see the link in the description below. However, these tips are going to be very solid starter steps for you. They're not going to be easy, but they're not easy because it's not meant to be easy. There is no path there. It's kind of like saying, hey, you should do these workouts at the gym, and you're like, oh, I would love to do that and get stronger, but I also don't like the fact that it makes me have to work out. It's like, there is no way for you to achieve that without doing the work. You know those like platforms that you stand on that just like vibrates you, and then like, you know, it's like burn your belly fat, and there's like this, you know, this belt around you, and it just kind of like vibrates on the spot, like the shake weight thing. It doesn't work, okay? It doesn't work. You need to put in the work. There is no secret magic hack for this, okay? So here are the tips that I'm gonna start you off with. The first one is make sure your mind map is an accurate reflection of your thought process. And when I say thought process, I'm talking about like the pattern of thinking and the order in which you've thought about things. It needs to reflect the type of thinking that you've done. If it doesn't reflect that, then it's going to be very hard to improve on it, because you've essentially got two completely different processes that are not linked together. You've got thinking that's going on, which may frankly be quite good. And a lot of people that have higher levels of deep processing that are naturally kind of, you know, they don't have to try that hard to get good grades, or they're, you know, it's enough just to use a few flashcards here and there. People that are like that often have subconsciously a decent level of deep processing that's going on that you can really tap into and then absolutely weaponize. If you don't have that kind of natural ability per se, then it's even more important to be in tune with that, because you need to know what's going on in your head to start retraining yourself to think more like the people that are naturally intelligent. So in order to start fixing that, you need to know what's happening, and it's a great tool to have a mind map that shows what's happening rather than just like constantly being just deeply introspective and reflective. You know, it's a lot easier to have the introspection as well as like a visual cue that you can look at and think, oh, okay, so this part looks a little bit weird. So therefore, the way that I was thinking about that must also be a little bit disorganized, right? We want to be able to have those insights. So that's the first reason. The second reason is because we want the mind map itself to facilitate the right type of thinking. So we need to get into the habit of making sure that when we're writing the notes, we're not just writing it thoughtlessly. We're not just like reading it and then just writing it straight away. We want to be thinking about it first, and we want to know what we want to put down and how we want to put it down. When I was doing this, you'll see that I was just going ham. I was essentially just spamming out the words onto the page, and it wasn't activating any cognitive effects. And as a result, you can see that, you know, it ends up looking really, really messy. Instead of doing that, I should have thought about everything that I'm going to put down on the page first, and then organize that a little bit more. And so by holding ourselves accountable to what we are putting down, that's also going to force us to engage in the right type of cognitive process. It's kind of this feedback loop. It gives us the chance to catch ourselves when we're not doing the right type of thinking. So that's the first tip, is to make sure that they're very well aligned. You want to make sure your mind map is truly a map of your mind. In this example here that I've shown, it is a map of my mind in the way that I've done this. It is disorganized, it is hard to follow, and that's because the way that I was thinking about it is passive. I never bothered to organize it, and so naturally it will just be disorganized. Even though it looked so neat when it was in that list form, you can see in actual fact, just trying to get even a little bit of depth, it falls apart. And in your brain, this is how it's gonna learn it. It's not gonna learn it in that list. Otherwise, studying would be really easy if you could just be like, and then just store it into your brain. It doesn't work like that. Your brain is gonna think about it more in this networked kind of way. And if this is a network that it's formed, that's not something that's gonna last. It's gonna say, this is an incomprehensible tangle of information. I don't know why it's relevant to keep. Let's bin this, and there you go, you've forgotten half of it. The second tip is what I've already talked about, which is to not avoid the effort and the thinking process with cleaning this up and organizing it. And what type of thinking do we wanna engage in? Here's the kind of sort of lighthouse that you should be following is try to get it to a point where the way you've organized it and the way you've expressed the relationships feels as simple and as logical, and here's the key one, as intuitive as possible. So when we say that something is logical and intuitive, what we are saying is that our brain feels that it just makes sense. That feeling that it just makes sense is our brain saying, this is relevant, I get it, it fits in with my existing knowledge structures. If you're a strong competitive swimmer and you learn something about biology that reminds you of something you learned about swimming, that is going to be easier to remember because it has a way to fit. You know how to understand it through the lens of swimming. If you are great at playing an instrument or playing a sport, and then you learn something about how learning works, you might think, oh yeah, I actually do that when I'm learning my instrument or learning how to play my sport better. It would make sense that I might be able to use that same kind of process in my academic studies. So you would be able to understand that learning technique a little bit more easily than someone that didn't have that experience. So it would make sense because it fits with your existing knowledge schemas. So we're always looking for a way to fit it with what makes sense to us. Whenever we say, oh, I don't really get this, I'm gonna need to repeat this. Whenever we get that feeling, I'm gonna need to repeat this again and again in my head. When we get that feeling like, I don't really get it, but I'm just gonna smash it through. Repetition, if you feel that repetition is gonna be necessary, that is your brain telling you, my dude, this is not relevant to me. I don't get it. I don't know why I need to hold on to it. And you are overriding that. You're saying, keep it, hold on to it, keep it, remember it, remember it. And that's why it takes repetition, because your brain doesn't get it. It's a red flag. It is a warning sign that should indicate that you need to think of another way to integrate and associate that information into your memory and truly consolidate it. So spend the time, spend the effort to get to the point where you can find the angle that makes it more intuitive. And this involves reading a little bit more. You're gonna have to go through your textbook again. You're gonna have to go through your notes. You're gonna have to ask more questions. You're gonna have to Google a lot of things to get the answer to see, does it make sense if it works this way? Can I group it in this way? Does this relationship make sense? That all takes effort and that takes time. However, just remember, as I've talked about in many of my other videos and as I've demonstrated through my own practice and as thousands of my students will testify to, you can join the Discord if you want to talk to them directly, they will testify to the fact that it saves massive time overall, because by not forgetting things and being able to reach higher levels of knowledge mastery at an earlier stage, you just cut down your total study time by a ton, especially for big, complex topics, university level and beyond. It thrives with this type of thinking. So let me just go through all of that. I'm now gonna exert effort and energy to make it feel more intuitive and more aligned. And then I'm gonna show you the end result of what that looks like. So let's take the exact same list of keywords, but this time I'm gonna think about it differently. Okay, so let's do that, and we're gonna do that side-by-side comparison. Okay, so that would take normally, I suppose, for me right now, it took probably 2 to 3 times longer than the first one. And in reality, it would also be like 2 to 3 times longer because you're looking through the material, yada, 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 to form it. But right now, what I've got here is not even that clean or tidy or neat, to be honest. It's pretty, it's fairly rudimentary. It's not cleaned up. I'd like to space it out a little bit more because it's looking a little bit cramped. Hopefully you can see if I put them side by side, this one is just impossible to follow. Whereas this one, although there is a lot going on, it actually feels like it has a lot more structure. So this would be the way that the brain of someone that has really thought about it and has more expertise would think about it. And hopefully you can tell that when you're sort of looking at me doing it, there's a lot more time spent thinking about what's going on, looking at things, a lot less time on actually writing. most of that time just on thinking, and in your case, it would also be time on reading and looking things up and things like that. But again, a good time investment, very solid returns on that. Result, the mind map itself, you can see that they obviously look different, but to an untrained eye, you would say they're different, but you wouldn't really appreciate necessarily the significance of the difference, especially if you're getting something that looks kind of neat and tidy. However, again, like I mentioned before, there are multiple ways you could group it. I've decided to group it like this, but there are also completely other ways of grouping it and different relationships that you could have that another person could think of that would be equally as valid if that's the way that was most intuitive for them and their knowledge structures. For me, this feels very intuitive because I'm used to thinking about things in this kind of structure. So again, it depends completely on your own mind and the way that you process it. If you put in the effort and you seek that intuitive, simple level, then you will find that the mind map technique becomes much deeper, a little bit more uncomfortable, but much more effective than you would have thought if you had previous bad experiences with it. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna actually flick to an interview that I did of a couple of my students. One of them is Archer, who is a top 0.05% achiever. He got one of the highest results in Australia in his final year of high school. He sat like double the amount of papers that you're normally meant to sit in the year, and he got first in the state for I think 6 of them. He did 2 university papers in his final year of high school, getting the highest possible grade at the same time. He got a 99.95 ATAR, which is the highest possible rank that you can get in the country. He was awarded like some medal of commemoration. He's currently going through medical school on a perfect GPA, and Archer actually works at I Can Study. And so I'm in close contact with him all of the time, and Archer works more than full-time hours while going through medical school. And he's received the letter from the dean 2 years in a row for being one of the top performing students of the cohort. So this is a guy that does not study very much because he's got his efficiency dialed in. I started working with him after year 12 giving him more advanced, slightly more refined skills so that he could tackle medical school and do even more than he was doing when he was back in year 12. The other person that we're talking to is Derek. Derek's a student that I was working with in his final year of high school. I started working with him in the early part of the year, or the late part of his second to last year, and they ended up finishing the year with one of the highest IB grades in the world. Obviously just completely clocking out and getting the highest possible mark, but also beating the grade boundary for the highest mark, beating the threshold that you need to get by sometimes 20 to 30%. So Derek is also going through medical school at the moment and doing exceptionally well, getting great results so far. And so what we're gonna talk about with them is sort of their experience with mind mapping, and the idea here is to get you a perspective that's not just my own, but of other students that may be a little closer to your current background or experience or level, in terms of the way that they think about this and the things that they've seen and the things that they've noticed, just so that if you're on the fence about what I've talked about, you've at least got a few more people there as well. Both Derek and Archer are coaches at I Can Study as well. Have a look at that interview. It's pretty short. And if you want to watch more sort of interviews with many of the students that I have, then let me know in the comments as well. I can always do more interviews. I have hundreds of students that are super willing to jump on YouTube and do an interview with me talking about their experience. So if you're interested in seeing some of those types of things, then definitely let me know as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you found this video useful and insightful, then please share it with your friends. Don't throw them under the bus and take all the good techniques just for yourselves. Share it with your friends, leave a like. It really helps with the algorithm. You know the jazz, it's how YouTube works. And if you want to see more of this type of content, then please subscribe. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next one. When did you have this older method of mind mapping?
During year 11. Okay, the first time I actually did mind mapping was probably like in year 10. So I would basically, and it was because my teacher set it as like some task. So basically we were told to make a mind map on this topic. So what I did was I just got, well, I didn't even collect keywords. Like it was just like, okay, here's like a bunch of information. So let me try and like vaguely group it together. But the groups would basically just be like how it was taught. And then it would just be me reorganizing the information that was like already taught to me. So it was essentially kind of like useless. Like I didn't really remember much of it. And yeah, it was just words, right? It was just like the topic header and then just like a bunch of sentences underneath. So that didn't really help at all. And that's why initially I was like, yeah, mind maps are useless. But then obviously like when I actually learned how to do mind maps for real, then it was much different because I realized that it's not about the physical act of actually like writing things down on a piece of paper. It's the thing that like is happening in my mind to actually create that mind map, like cognitively in my mind. In order to form like a good quality mind map, I need to be like thinking about how things relate and like the chunking and organizing my chunking structure and comparing different flows and chunk structures with each other. And that requires like a lot of cognitive effort. And that's pretty much what the benefit is. And I realized that, yeah, it doesn't really matter what the mind map looks like as long as what you're doing in your head is, correct. So that was like my revelation.
The biggest, funniest thing for me was essentially when I was doing mind maps before, it was way easier, felt way more, I guess, kind of fun to like just draw lines and connect it all together. And then after kind of learning how to mind map more properly, it just became way harder. But the difference was instead of me usually like maybe my year 10 self, where I'd kind of like shy away from that kind of cognitive load and things. Instead, I'm like, okay, I actually know this effort and this discomfort's a good thing. And so I kind of always just relate it to the way in which you might go to the gym and lift weights. You don't want to lift like the 5 kilograms. You want to lift like 50 kilograms or something like that, which is actually going to make you get better at that process. And that's been like a much bigger change for me. And also, it's kind of like always kind of against what you may expect. Like my mind maps now may have way less words than kind of my previous mind maps, which looked like they had way more going on. So if you were to look at my mind maps now, you'd probably be like, well, Archer probably doesn't know too much about what's going on here, but it's actually completely the opposite, where my mind map doesn't have that many words, and there's very clear relationships. You can see the backbone very clearly. I actually know way more and I can talk about it way more, which is just the funny thing.
That's an important thing, right? Because like people think that if there's more going on, it means that it's better. But actually, it's the other way around, because you need to have a deeper level of knowledge to be able to prioritize very strictly and know what is relevant, where to place things, and how to make it clean. Like if you don't know that, you got to overcompensate by just drawing more arrows and writing more words, because you're just trying to fill in these like knowledge gaps that just, I don't know, like never really bothered to think about.
I think I've had quite a few experiences with mind maps before learning the technique. I think the first one was when I was introduced to it really, really young. And I think what the idea of a mind map that was taught to me was like the main idea in the center, and it will be in a cloud. And then you'd have all the big topics coming out from the cloud. So some arrows pointing out. And I really thought it was pointless because I might as well have that same information written out on a page that's easier and neater, rather than just a cloud with some words here, another group of words here, another group of words here, and just more in different colors. I just hated it. I thought mind maps were rubbish because I didn't really like all these colors, and I was kind of a weird kid. I didn't really like all these colors and extra decorations.
Yeah, that's how I first learned it as well. And I thought it was useless too when I first encountered it. Yeah, the cloud thing, eh?
Yeah, oh my God.
So from there, every time I heard of a mind map, I internally just felt some disgust. I don't know. But then I think the next time I actually learned about similar note-taking techniques was when I was introduced to the idea of concept mapping. So this one is a little bit more structured. Okay, I don't remember precisely how it works, but it has a structure of like linking different ideas together by action verbs. And then you put the action verb in a square. So I think I've sent some of these in the Discord before, but I don't think I've actually shown it. What I found that it did help was much more effective than the whole cloud thing, but I found it way too messy to be much use, because there were too many arrows with too many words pointing here and then, and things got crowded very fast. But I think like what you said is, it's not about what the mind map looks like. Like what Archer said, it looks like there's a lot going on and you think you probably know but everything is not really organized in your head. But when you're able to prioritize and see the big picture and see how things relate, and you can see that very clear structure in your mind map, and that reflecting what's going on in your head, then you realize, oh, actually, when you've thought about it more and you're able to simplify, it does show in your mind map. And I think that is the important thing.
And the other thing as well is like when I first saw mind mapping ages ago, maybe like early stages of high school, I didn't really associate it with, I guess, like a hardworking student. It's like too creative and fun to be, you know, a thing that someone who's getting like top grades would be doing. And so something like having really nice, I don't know, typed out notes of all these diagrams and big terminology words was something that when I was much younger, I'm way more preferred because it looks like you're doing something. Which again, in this case, you want to be doing the opposite.